Hey, everybody, welcome back. This is SIC Talks number 74. We're here with Noah Brier, who is an old friend, longtime friend, and longtime sort of inspiration, if you want to be honest about, or if I want to be honest about it. In fact, Why Is This Interesting, which is the newsletter that he and Colin Nagy started, Noah, 4 or 5 years ago now? At this point, it's got to be
just a little over 5 years ago.
5 years ago. Was one of the inspirations for moving SIC to Substack from the internal email that it had been, and then also just generally like trying to be, if not encyclopedic, then at the very least, comprehensive about topics that you can cover on the internet. It's a really, constant source of information for me and many others, including like Emily Sundberg, who was a guest recently, who many people watched, and who I know is a big fan of Witties. Colin is also the founder of Brand, which is BRXND, or I'm off to a great start here. Jesus Christ. Noah, is also the founder of Brand, which is a company concerned with AI and how it manifests itself through media and culture and just life in general. And in fact is convening its second conference in May, which I went to last year for the inaugural one and was just fascinated by. So anyway, Noah, or Colin, as I like to call you, how's it going, man? How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I am doing all right. So we've been back and forth this week on a couple of things. One was my very late arrival to the public launch of Twitty Recommends, which is at interesting.us, which is a recommendation site put together by combing through all of the recommendations made on Why Is This Interesting over the last 5 years and turning them into sort of actionable links and that sort of stuff. It's a really cool resource and also a cool demonstration of what AI, I think, probably is best suited for. Although, no, I'd love you to correct me on this. Like, it's basically doing the busy work for you and allowing you to focus on higher level thinking, higher concepts, and so on and so forth. Is that kind of the way you think about it, or am I misrepresenting it?
Yeah, that's the way I think about it. It's like a project I think we had in our head for a long time. I wanted to kind of, when you publish a newsletter frequently, like we do every day, just build up a big backlog of interesting products and resources and things like that. And I kind of had specifically wanted to pull them out because as great as the newsletter format is, it's not sort of, fantastic for kind of the specific recommendations. And so, but it sort of was one of those projects that kind of just stayed on the back burner because it's such a pain in the ass, Right. It's like, how do you comb through 1,500 newsletters and pull out the links? And, I could hire a bunch of people to do it or, take a bunch of time myself. But I think kind of AI for those kinds of problems is amazing. So, I basically built this pipeline where I just pumped all the content through it. I sucked out the recommendations. I actually built another system that went and tried to find the best link, ideally to Amazon, so we could get affiliate revenue back.
Okay. Got it.
And then, like pulled in descriptions for the products and, it pulls in the recommendations directly from the Witty. So, it pulls in, it's like, hey, Ben said he likes these shoes. And, here's why he likes them. But then it pulls the product description from the site and, it just links off. And so it just becomes this sort of big search engine of just interesting products that, people like ourselves.
From qualified recommenders. And so, and the advantage that it has from an audience standpoint versus something like The Strategist or a Wirecutter is that all of these qualified recommendations are coming from people who aren't being, there's no payment for any of the recommendations. It's all based on real enthusiasm. And so you can trust them to the extent that you feel the need to trust a recommendation from a quote unquote, objective source. It has become a thing that people use to some degree and that people talk about to some degree. We were just talking off mic about Zach Seward from the New York Times bringing it up in some of his sort of public talks, because it manifests this kind of usefulness through AI, which I think gets lost in some of the general kind of discourse around the that, you know, the software or the sort of the rubric generally. Am I right about that? Am I missing anything in terms of what Zach's saying?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Zach Stewart, who's over at the Times now, spending his time thinking about kind of how to integrate AI into the organization and the news reporting, gave a talk recently, and yeah, he highlighted the Witty Recommends site as an example of sort of, you know, using AI for something that just wasn't really reasonable to do with humans. And you know, I would say, you know, most of my work is more on the corporate side. Like I spend a lot of time working with brands and talking to them about sort of, you know, how they think about AI. And I do see the sort of pattern keep emerging over and over again, which is like the first place people go is, how do I have AI do this thing that I'm really good at? It's like, I don't need AI to write witties for us. Like I have great people who contribute to it. Like, why would I have no interest in replacing that. It's like, I'm much more interested in using AI for this thing that is a project I wanted to exist. Like I wanted to manifest it into the world. It's never going to be Wirecutter or The Strategist or whatever, but it's just like a thing that I thought should exist. And now it can, and that's just kind of awesome. And, you know, I probably did the whole thing for a couple $100, right? Like, that's just the thing. Amazing.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, you know, if nothing else, it's adding real utility using a tool that I think you could argue is adding marginal utility or potentially marginal distraction in a lot of respects, much of the time. And I think this is probably where, you know, in this year's brand conference, you're going to get the rubber meeting the road, right? I tell the story a lot. Or story is probably even the wrong word, but I sort of relate my experience with this app, Riverside, that we're recording on, and its AI transcriptions, right? Like this conversation will be transcribed. That will allow me to do subtitling. That's a valuable addition to this that I didn't have before because I'm not paying a transcriber. I'm not taking the time to transcribe myself. But by the same token, the AI will get every proper noun that we say wrong without fail, which means that I have to go back through and I have to effectively edit the piece, right? So it has created a job for me that I didn't have before under the guise of creating an efficiency for me. And I would say that the balance between those two things is probably 80% efficiency or new utility and 20% new work. Is that like do you feel like that's a sort of a typical experience for brands or for, you know, users generally, or am I an outlier in some way?
Yeah, I think that's probably typical. You know, I think one of the things that I've heard kind of relayed a bunch is, you know, how there's the different levels of self-driving. You know, it's like level 1 is hands on the wheel, and level 2, there's sort of a specific.
Oh, you're talking about actual self-driving.
Yeah,
okay, gotcha.
Right,
and
it's like, you know, level 4 self-driving is like full self-driving. I don't know. This is not my area of expertise. But the idea is like, you know, there are these sort of tiers, and at one point you take your hands off the wheel. And I do think like that. I've heard more and more people using that sort of analogy. And obviously self-driving is also AI, but in a different sphere. But I think kind of what you're describing is like, you're like, okay, well, you know, this job that like theoretically you used to have it, you didn't do it, you just didn't have it before. You know, it's now you're sort of like, you're kind of like hands on the, your job is to kind of like take corrective action, right? It's sort of like level 2, right? Like you don't need to drive it. Like it's mostly going to get where you need to get. You just need to kind of like move the wheel around a little bit, and it's obviously a lot safer than autopilot.
Yeah, for sure.
But you know, I do think probably that's a kind of reasonable pattern that will exist, particularly as like, you know, again, I think the place to focus attention with this technology is not on the things you're already really good at. It's on the things where like, and so in a lot of those things, you're you're sort of wading, I find myself wading into worlds I don't know a lot about, right?
Sure.
Like I haven't dealt in the world of transcription a lot. Maybe this is really common. Maybe like, I just like haven't done enough of this to really know. And so some of it I think is just running into the kind of, I do and then I think the sort of next step probably is just, we'll kind of iron out a lot of those things and you'll find automations for them and you'll learn more about them.
That's what it's funny. I was struck. The talk that really struck me, and I'm sure this was true of many people last year. The talk that struck me in particular last year at the brand conference was Tim Huang, who used to run some kind of policy at Google,
public policy at Google,
was basically saying like, at the time there was a lot of conversation around hallucination and AIs making things up, and he said, look, hallucination is a feature of this technology, not a bug. So think of it that way. And that reframing was really helpful for me because it allowed me to go, oh, wait a minute, this is not apocalyptic. This is not even necessarily existential. This is just a factor to contend with. And there are advantages in its liabilities and there are disadvantages in its strengths. And so let's, assess it accordingly. So I use the transcription example just as what I think is like a pretty easy to understand place where the rubber meets the road, right? Like where things that are 80% there are still 20% not there, and 20% is a gigantic delta if you're talking about, real experience.
Yeah, and that's, I think my Witty Recommends thing is like, that's probably an 80% project, if I'm being honest. Like, it's not ever going to be Wirecutter or Strategist because those are 100% projects, right? Like there are a bunch of people working on them. But this thing cost me a few $100 and I got it out in a week. Yeah. And I think it's cool and interesting. And I think it's a resource that people seem to be into. And, so it's like, it's sort of a nice added bonus for our audience of folks who are, into what we do. And, I think that's just, I don't know, like, for me, it's pretty simple. It's like, I take great joy in kind of like manifesting creative work into the world. And my ability to do that has just been amplified.
I wanted to ask you about that because one of the things that, one of the places that people may know you is that you built and then sold a company called Percolate, which, I would sort of broadly situate in social listening and working as a B2B aid for brands to be more effective through social platforms. What it manifests in some, if you think about it in a certain way, is a tool to allow brands to work in public is a term that sometimes gets thrown around, but you strike me as somebody who is comfortable working in public, meaning like letting people see how the sausage is being made while you're making it and taking and adapting feedback as you go. Has that been you from the beginning, or did you learn that through sort of experience?
Well, I grew up writing, right? And I sort of grew up on the internet and I had a blog early and I met lots of other people. And I do think some of that is the blogging ethos, right? Like I always sort of looked at blogging not as writing, but as thinking in writing.
Interesting.
Like it was a sort of external thought process. And that was the easiest way to think about it. It was not like, these are the final fully baked ideas. They're the sort of beginnings of thoughts that I'm kind of putting into the world. So in some ways, I feel like that notion is sort of born out of that. And then, I think kind of more recently, the stuff I've been doing with brand, which has been very heavily, I'd say that has been a little more purposeful in kind of building publicly because, as I'm sure you've noticed, there's a lot of noise around AI.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of people talking shit. Like there's so much. And so I think, I kind of have made I have purposely tried to differentiate myself by talking as little as possible about anything but the stuff that I'm building and the things I'm getting my hands on. Because I figure, that's a good that's a good point of differentiation between what I'm
Yeah.
doing and everyone else.
It's
But yeah.
it's funny. I thought you were going to say I have been trying to focus myself on being, I don't know what, like non-declarative. In other words, operating in with an acknowledgement that there is a lot of blank space in as yet undefined elements. But I think what you're doing, the way you answered it is actually even better, which is simply to say, like, I talk about the stuff that I am involved in because I actually know that stuff. Whereas to try to comment on what's unknowable is sort of futile. That actually brings us to something I wanted to ask you about. So ostensibly, the point of these conversations is to track or to complement the list of links that goes into the SIC newsletter every week. And so I sent you a work in progress list, and you responded by saying, "Hey, can we talk about this?" And you sent a New York Times article from from Monday, which is called "AI Has a Measurement Problem." This is Kevin Roos, who is the Hard Fork podcast co-host and also just the technology writer, AI writer at the New York Times. What was it about this article that jumped out at you and that you wanted to discuss?
Yeah, well, part of it is I was just excited about talking about this with you because I think this is sort of very much in your wheelhouse, and it's something I've been circling around a bunch, which is like, and you kind of hit on a little bit. Tim talked about a little last year with his hallucination stuff, but one of the like fundamentally confusing things I have found in this world of AI is that like these evaluations just don't do it justice, right? Like you have these models. And, the way I sort of conceive of it, it's a slightly simplified version, but I think it's a reasonable kind of mental model is like these evals are like giving it the SAT, right? And so it's a way to sort of say, hey, there's an even playing field, but it's like giving an art school student the SAT and being like, are they a good art school student? Right.
Yeah,
and you're
yeah,
like,
for sure.
well, like, what does this have to do with anything? I have no idea. And I think anybody who is spending time around these has this feeling that like the only way to really measure them is like the vibes, right? That it's all sort of, it's all heuristics and taste and so again, in the spirit of sort of thinking out loud and half-baked ideas, is like I'm just kind of obsessed with taste and its role in AI and how do you measure it? Like how do you measure the vibe? So it's like, an example of this is lately so Anthropic released a new model called Claude 3. And it's the first sort of model that's really competitive with GPT-4. And so, whatever, my job is to kind of play with this stuff. And so I was playing with it and it's amazing and it's really good. And it's a better writer. Like, I think it's a better writer. Like, I can't tell you exactly why. I can just tell you that GPT-4.
Better than ChatGPT. GPT-4.
Yes.
Yeah,
ChatGPT, which uses GPT-4. And, again, not that I'm having it write a lot of stuff, but I certainly have it edit a lot of my stuff and I have it respond. And, it's like its ability to write. It's just a better writer. Like again, it's like part of what's challenging is I can't say exactly why it's a better writer. I can just tell you that, I was a journalist once and I've spent a lot of time writing and I can tell you this is a better writer. And I have some ideas on why it's better. Like I think part of what it's doing is it's better at sort of mimicking your style. And so it sounds better to you. Because it sort of reads into your style cues in your prompt. And then it sort of extracts them and answers. And so, like, and I think that's a thing people do too, right? Like,
of course.
That's when you're in a meeting, it's a sales strategy. Like, it's
code switching.
Yeah. And so anyway, this is that article. And then there's been lots of tweets sort of in this realm this week. And it's just been kind of banging around in my head, which is, it's just this like really interesting, it seems like AI would be the last sort of place where you talk about the importance of taste. But I think we're actually kind of like seeing it's exactly the opposite. There was a great quote, actually. I just put it on my newsletter, my brand newsletter today. And I'll send you this link so you can include it.
Please. I'd love to link to
with the links. But Daniel Gross ran AI at Apple for a while, and now he's a big investor in AI stuff. And he had this point that like it was coming out of all the Google stuff with their images,
sure.
and so he made this
This
point
is
that
this is where they made Black and Asian Nazis.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he made this point that it looks like the process of fine tuning these models. So basically, the way these models come to be is you train them on these large data sets, and then after you train them, you fine tune them, right? So you make them you make them good at this particular thing, right? Like you make ChatGPT good at answering questions, and part of that is this human feedback process. And it basically, he made this comment that like it looks like fine tuning is very dependent on the taste of the tuners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that
of course.
that like a good model is only going to come from people with good taste. And like one of the interesting things is this little company in France called Mistral seems to like be able to do this really well. And like they seem to just have better taste in how they fine tune and like taste in the data sets they're choosing. Anyway,
that's so interesting.
All of this to say, like, I don't have an answer on this, but given the kinds of stuff that you're interested in, this sort of intersection of AI and taste felt like fertile territory.
It's so funny, man. It's like that takes me in so many different directions, because it's on the one hand, like Daisy Eliotto, who does Dirt, talks a lot about the taste economy. And in fact, when she was on the show, we talked a lot about that. This notion that we've reached like the end of, let's call it, discernible, differentiated digital recommendation systems, right? And so what you have to then rely on is people who have taste, right? And Daisy's interesting because she is figuring out ways to involve AI, much in the way that you described earlier, but into that. But it's this real notion. I think she's getting to it intuitively in a way that you might be getting to it a little bit more like categorically or scientifically. That's one thing. The second thing is that it makes me grateful to be pushing 50 and have 30 years of professional experience that I can build upon, and makes me feel less obsolete or whatever. That's one thing. And then it also gives me, I'm about to send a 17-year-old to college, and he doesn't want to study engineering. He doesn't want to study computer science. He doesn't want to do any of that sort of stuff that over the last 15 years we've been told like that's where the growth industry is or whatever. So this conversation is just like, yeah, actually go study humanities, like figure out what the real classic Western liberal arts education is like. And you will end up better off by virtue of the fact that these systems will take care of all of that stuff. What an interesting set of vectors that question or that provocation brings to mind.
Yeah. And I think, I do think a lot of the work that happens around AI is kind of it is very humanities based. It's very like a lot of the work I find myself doing. I'm doing a project now with a podcast company who makes kids podcasts, and a lot of what I'm trying to do is sort of download the educators who work on the show's brain and understand kind of how they look at the world and try to sort of turn that into words, right? Like one of the outputs of the first step in this project is doing some tagging many episodes of a podcast. And part of it is like it's not that it's good enough to just tag the episodes. They have to be tagged in a way that is like helpful for the audience age range, right? And so it can't be too complicated, but I don't really know that, right? Like that's not I've never been an educator, so I've got to kind of like go back to them and try to understand it. And then it's literally like, somebody said to me that part of the magic of these systems that people are experiencing is like, for people who haven't written code, this is sort of their first time making a computer do exactly what they want.
Sure.
And I think that's true. That is like that. I had a little bit of a light bulb moment when he said that, because I was like, oh yeah, I do write code, and it is a magical feeling to be able to have a computer do that. And it is amazing to me. And it turns out actually that sort of like this English language programming that you do when you're effectively prompting these machines is also just an incredibly powerful mechanism. I'm not on the side that I think coding is going away. But anyway, all of that is to say, I think like, yeah, somehow it feels like taste is more important. And it feels like
Interesting.
also there's a very big opportunity. The people who are making the models and the people who are making these evaluations seem to not have any sense of taste, right? It's like, it's
Right.
like they're giving these things the SAT and they're like, oh yeah, that's how we'll figure out whether they're good. But everybody using them is like, well, no, I don't care what the benchmarks say. Like,
No. Yeah.
it's like, well, who cares? This thing got a 1500 on the math portion. And it's like, yeah, like it couldn't mean less to me.
Right.
And I don't know. I kind of love that. I don't know what to do with it yet. I actually had a breakfast meeting this morning with some friends trying to figure out what to do with it. We have a couple kind of fun ideas to throw around that hopefully I'll
This
start
is Twitty
working on.
Recommends.
No, this is the question of evaluations and
okay.
and how do you make it more taste based and like how do you actually how do we start to sort of like move the evaluation of these models away from this, like it's kind of like, they're evaluating the models the way, we got evaluated in school when we were kids.
Yeah.
It turns out that's not the most useful evaluation method.
Right. Well, it's fascinating. So what do you think, like, how is this discussion going to manifest itself at the brand conference in 3 weeks? Like, do you think that, in other words, do you think this is a conversation that everybody else is having and it sort of coalesces there? Or is that a moment where it reveals itself as a vibe that everybody
this particular
takes
conversation
on?
I think it's sort of I would say I have a couple different goals for the event, right? Like one of them is just like ground people, right? Like that was the goal last year, was just like,
okay, and it was very effective at that.
We don't need to like talk about this at some big high level, like we don't need to talk about the future. Let's just like see crazy shit and like like open up the sort of aperture, because one of the like funny, this is a bit of an aside, but like one of the funny things I've been noticing is that for as new as this technology is, like I feel like a lot of people are already kind of sure they know what it can do and what it can't do and how it's going to work, and you're like, guys, it's like you've been using this for 3 months, like what are you talking about? Like just like keep an open mind, like things move fast. And then, I do think another part of it is to try to kind of put some language around some of the stuff we've been feeling. So we talked a little about vibes last year. And I do think like I think we have like slightly better language. And so actually Tim is coming back. And one of the things, I've been talking to him about a bunch is, one of the funny things you can start to notice in these systems is that they have picked up on some sort of like, human behavioral cues. Presumably they picked it up by reading about them.
Right.
But they seem to have some of the biases that we have. And it's unclear whether that is because they're fundamental to thinking systems or whatever, or if just they read about them a bunch on the internet because there's lots of content about biases. And so they have like taken them on. Like there was a funny story from December where some people got very sure that ChatGPT got lazy. And then some other people, and like enough of this went around that OpenAI even acknowledged that like it was looking into the laziness problem, which is just like an amazing like moment.
Well, we want to transmogrify everything into some kind of human analog, right? Like, so.
But the thing is, with these, it is possible. Like, so somebody offered up the possible explanation, which I don't think is true, but I think it's like amazing that it could be true. That like maybe these things read enough emails and things on the internet where people were just not doing a lot in December because they were like getting ready for the holidays, that it is just reacting.
That's so funny.
Right. And it's like, that is almost definitely not what was happening. but it's not impossible that it could happen.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's like amazing and mind blowing and so weird, right? And it's like, again, it just sort of comes down to this, like, these are just like sort of vibe machines, right? They're just like these weird, like, they read all the stuff and they collect it and they kind of like even it out and they come to these conclusions about the world that are, again, sometimes they're technically inaccurate, but they're like perceptually accurate, right?
Yeah.
Like they're like, that's the way I keep describing, like one of the examples I showed at the conference last year is when I built this collabs machine and it kept kicking out sneakers with swooshes on them.
Right.
And even then when it was like a Duncan Saucony collab and it was like, it had a swoosh. And, you know, my point with that was always like, that's technically a hallucination, right? But it's like, but it's perceptually correct. Like if we went and we polled 100 people and we asked them like to draw a Duncan Saucony sneaker, like some large portion of them would put a swoosh on them because they don't know what a Saucony logo looks like.
Right. Sure.
Like sneakers are Nikes. Like this is, you know, and so I don't know.
Increasingly not, but that's a
increasingly not, and that was one of the articles in there. Yes, but still, you know, they hold the mind share, right?
Yeah.
And the magic of this is they are, I mean, like it kind of feels like these are computer systems technically, right? It's statistics in the background and probabilities, but they are like humanities engines, right? In the front, like,
sure.
And I don't know, we just like, we don't have a, like, so I mean, even going back to the thing you said earlier, like, I think part of the reason I've been non-committal on kind of what is going on with all this stuff is because I think it would be irresponsible, and I think it is irresponsible to be super committal on this because it's just like we're just living through something weird, and like I don't know, like and when you have the smartest people, you know, like you turn to the people who are deepest in it, you know, people working at these model companies, and they're the ones saying, "Hey, we don't totally understand what's going on."
Yeah,
I think you have to, you know, you can't take that for granted.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It evokes, I haven't thought of it in a couple of years, but it evokes an article that 032C wrote in 2016, I want to say, called The Big Flat Now, that was about essentially how digital platforms had flattened the timeline metaphorically and literally to the point where almost any point in human history is as accessible as yesterday was or as tomorrow will be. And so the rules fundamentally change in, you know, myriad ways. But and again, that opens up some interesting opportunities, and it also creates some intriguing liabilities for the first time. So yeah, I wonder. I'll link to the Big Flat Now article because that one really blew my mind at the time I read it. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, Noah, is if you have a point of view or if there is a collective sort of read on how AI systems going forward think about the future, right? Because they are all based on fundamentally the past, right? It is a predictive result for what in the history of the universe, or in the history of recorded human communication, what is the next likely word, and then the next likely word after that, or what is the next likely, you know, frame in a movie or a you know, element of a drawing. But are we anywhere near actually understanding what the future even is as a concept?
I don't know, man. That's a little bit above my pay grade, I think. Okay. I think there's a lot of people, you know, I would say there is debate amongst the people who are closest to this. Like somebody I track pretty closely on this stuff is a scientist named Melanie Mitchell. She is at the Santa Fe Institute. She's written written a couple of books on AI. She's been studying AI for 40 years. She studied under Doug Hofstadter, wrote Gödel Escher Bach, like, you know, and one of the things that, so, you know, she is sort of very certain and has lots of very good examples that, like, we shouldn't think of these things as intelligent. You know, like one of the stories she tells is that, you know, they taught they used AI to learn how to play the breakout game,
Sure.
with the ball, and it got really
Yep.
good, right? It figured out how to
OG Atari style
yeah, exactly.
video
Figured out how to
game
get
based
above
on
the
geometry and angle thing.
blocks,
Yeah.
and it got really good. And then they moved the paddle down 2 pixels, and it couldn't play anymore, right? And it's like like
Right.
my 6-year-old could easily overcome that problem, right? Like that's not she wouldn't even notice. Like she would just keep playing, and the paddle would be 2 pixels lower, and it would mean nothing to her, right?
Yeah,
and so it's
of course.
like intelligence clearly has a lot to do with adaptability and all these other things, and so but like other people don't agree with her who are also sort of like very serious scientists and have spent their lifetime working around these systems. And so I think I don't personally, like, I am not a person deep enough in the sort of like scientific side of this world to know the answer. But the other is I know enough to know that like very intelligent people disagree.
Right.
Like, and I think that's interesting. Like, Melanie Mitchell and Doug Hofstadter. So, Hofstadter is like, a hero of mine and an incredible thinker. And, was her like, also a hero of hers. Like she saw him at a lecture, and then she changed what she was doing in her life and signed up to be his
Oh, wow. Really?
doctoral
Interesting.
student in, 1980 something. And, but they don't agree on sort of like the state of and like the risk and all this stuff. So, it's like if really smart people who really respect each other and come from the same sort of lineage, like intellectual lineage, can disagree,
sure.
then I think, like, again, it sort of comes back to the certainty thing. I think, we shouldn't, if those people disagree, we shouldn't be listening to the people who are totally certain that they know the answer to whatever the question is. So I don't know. I mean, I think these are, at least in my world, like these are, they're tools, right? They're systems right now, and they're amazing at some things. And another recommendation, which I would definitely put in the newsletter. My favorite book on this stuff is called The Most Human Human. It's by a guy named Brian Christensen. I think it's either Brian Christensen.
New book or old book?
Old book, probably 6 or 7 years old.
Okay.
So the story though is amazing. He, the Turing test or whatever, the Loebner Prize. So he, he got signed up to be a human in that. Right. So he got to be a person behind the curtain who the humans are speaking to, and they don't know whether they're speaking to a human or a computer. And he was one of the humans they were speaking to. And the book is about his preparation to like defend his humanhood in this competition. Right. So it's like, and the question, which like I kind of love, is how do you prove you're human to someone who can't see you, right? And it sounds like that answer would be really easy, but he goes through basically all the reasons that it's not really easy.
Yeah.
Right? That it's actually like much harder than it seems like it should be. And that like a lot of the things we think of as sort of fundamentally human are not like particularly human at all. Like there's a great story in there that at some point they tried to make the challenge harder by, instead of it being about a specific topic, it was going to be open-ended, because they were like, oh, it'll be much harder for computers to do open-ended. But it turned out it made it much easier, because it allowed everybody to start for 3 minutes with like, hey, Ben, how are you? Like, how's the weather where you are? How are your kids? Like, the sort of same set of what I think they call it phatic communication, where it's, it's sort of like the day-to-day things that we all start our conversations with. And if you let people have 3 minutes of that, that's like an incredibly easy thing to program, right? Like, you could almost do it deterministically. Like you almost don't need AI, right? Like I know you're going to say, hey, how are you?
It's subservient chicken at that point. I mean, it's
exactly.
Yeah, got it.
Totally. And yeah, the book is amazing. There's also, I mean, just, when it comes to creativity, one of the things, there's this, there's an amazing quote in there, and I eventually read the essay, but do you know Donald Barthelme? He's I think a poet
Name is
and
familiar,
a,
but I don't think so.
essayist. Anyway, he said he basically said not knowing is crucial to art, right? And
Yeah. Oh yeah.
and I have, like, since I read that book, I've sort of conceived of this kind of like curve, right? Like, of creativity is like this weird curve where it's like it can't be so random that you have no idea what's going to happen next, but it can't be so unrandom that it's perfectly easy to predict. There's some sweet spot, right? And again, it sort of comes back to that taste thing, like exactly where that is. It's almost hard possible to quantify. That's why, like, we haven't made machines that make art yet,
Right.
right? Like, artists can feel that point, right?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
sort
Yeah.
of, and it's probably somewhere in like between 60 and 80%. Like, if in the idea being that it's like 100% unpredictable, it just feels
Right.
random, right? And 0% unpredictable is just, like, we know exactly what's going to happen next.
Stultifying. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, anyway, the book is amazing. He gets into information theory. There's like lots of, I don't know. I love this intersection of like, computer science and the humanities.
No, I can tell, and beyond that, I mean, I think it's also you represent there in that I'm trying to avoid using the word intersection because I think it's totally overdone, but in that sort of coming together of forces, you generate the possibility for something net new as opposed to just a sort of a fine tuning of things that have existed before, which is part of my complaint about the way AI operates most of the time anyway. Speaking though, no, because you just given this impassioned book recommendation, I want to know what else you're reading. Like, what else from the list this week jumped out at you, or what else have you been paying attention to that, outside of the realm of this, core AI competency?
A couple other things that jumped out at me from the list. And again, they're going to sort of like stay, well, this one stays pretty nerdy, but the Microsoft cybersecurity stuff. Government hackers. It wasn't specifically in there, but I don't know if you saw a couple weeks ago, there was a pretty crazy backdoor that was found in this package that was going to get into Linux, and it was found by a Microsoft engineer. And it's like sort of first real evidence we've seen of this like supply chain attack. And that, I think, is just, again, I sort of like have been living in a pretty technical world lately, but like, there's a famous XKCD comic I'll send you the link to, and it basically shows that, like, all the world's technology is like eventually sort of sitting on this one little bit that is maintained by like some dude in Sweden who is like overworked and underpaid.
Literally, yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing, is that it all ultimately comes down to real, actual human resource
that
for all its fallibilities.
And like, when you read through the story on that whole QZ hack, like, they totally, so it seems to have been a state-sponsored thing where they took this maintainer of this package that ultimately made it in all the way up to Linux operating systems, and they just fucked with him, right? And so they did this two-pronged attack, and it was like social engineering, and they eventually got it so they could put code into it, and they put this like really terrible code into it that, had it made it out into the world, would have essentially made any computer that runs Linux vulnerable in this like incredibly dangerous way. And it was found by accident by a Microsoft researcher. But like all of this security stuff is just, like, we're living in a very complex world, like in the true sense, right? Like, not the sort of cliched complex, like literally, it is intertwined in ways that we can no longer untangle, right?
For sure.
It's like the definition of complexity. And I think, like, figuring out the sort of like how fragile that leaves it. And I think it sort of also just brings up bigger questions to me, like, it feels like we are living in a time where more weird stuff is happening. And I'm always skeptical of saying something like that because I think that generally, like, lots of weird stuff has happened throughout history, and like,
Yeah, for sure.
we should be sort of, acknowledge that. But it's like, whatever. If we just say over the last 20 years, like, this seems to be a sort of strange moment, right? And but then somebody pointed out maybe the strange moment was that we had like it was relatively placid for 10 years in there, right? Like maybe that was what was weird, not this moment.
Right. Exactly. The 70, 80 years of, broadly speaking, global peace is the anomaly over the course of recorded history, right? Like, yeah.
I think on the cybersecurity side, this stuff is like, we're going to see more and more of it, and I'm tracking it pretty closely. I also just had like some ridiculous identity theft stuff, and like I just think,
oh wow, really?
Yeah, and I mean, whatever, it was not a big deal. Like, they stole some points off a credit card, but
okay.
I went through a whole process with the bank where they tried to convince me I was vulnerable, and it turns out these people had been trying to guess my information for 2 months, and the bank just kept letting them guess.
Oh wow, really?
But I only found that out after 2 hours of them trying to convince me that like my computer had been hacked, and I was like, oh, I don't think that's the case. But I just think we're gonna have to. There's a lot of stuff to figure out in this realm, and both at the sort of macro level and the micro level, and again, we found this because of luck, right? And it's like Microsoft. That article about Microsoft, they're putting a lot in place, but it's just like, at the end of the day, what has always been true about hacking is like, humans are always the weak link. Like it's an emotional problem, not a technical one.
Right.
And now that all these things are interconnected, and the sort of access you can get is, pretty amazing. So, I don't know what the answer is again, but it's definitely a thing I'm tracking closely.
Yeah. That is interesting. So you're referring to an article in Quartz this week about Microsoft becoming ground zero for hackers, for state-sponsored hackers in particular, right? Which is the speculation of the underlying cause of this whole thing. What else jumped out at you?
Well, because I ran a strategy department, the article about strategy definitely did.
Right.
And I have to admit, I have not been inside an agency for over a decade now. So, I'm a little bit removed, and I don't really know what it's like. And I certainly have never worked inside a really, really large agency. But, I was also recently at a marketing event, and I had a very similar sort of experience, which is like, the more people talk about this sort of hard line between creative and strategy, the sort of like less engaged I get. And some of this is my own bias and the experiences that I've had, but I just don't really get it. Like, I just don't, I think that like, and so, whenever I read that kind of stuff, I'm always like, I think just the problem is that like, everybody just needs to chill out and get along. Like, I think that as an industry, advertising spends a lot of time trying to kind of like explain itself and explain its structure and whatever. I think everybody does this, right?
Well, but I mean, I think, so this is an article that was in IBB Online. It's an interview. It's in a conversation with the head of strategy at BBH in London, I presume, who, says she thinks of her role more as creative problem solving, and which is why I ended up with the article in the first place. Because from a pure positional standpoint, that's very much the way I kind of view it. Right. And where my experience has borne out the greatest success. The thing that you say, though, is interesting because, one of the things that I do now is consult with creative agencies, and they are I would say the ones that I am attracted to and the ones that I end up working with are ones that are pretty far forward in terms of the progressive view that everybody can contribute, and that, you may have specialist roles, but for the most part, like, everybody's valuable to the discussion. But even they resort to, definitional boundaries at some point. And it has a lot to do, I think, and I haven't had conversations with with any of them about this, but it has to do with the financial model. It's like, when you are being compensated essentially based on the value of Ben's time versus Noah's time, then it's pretty important that Ben spend his time on this thing and Noah spend his time on this thing. And I just feel like that model is doomed to failure in the long term. In the short term, maybe there are procurement departments that keep it going because it's easier for them to parse their own jobs. But at a fundamental level, it's that's what it comes down to. And so what we really have to look at is like, how do we change the incentives for people's participation and collaboration rather than, how do we demand that people stop thinking in boundary bounded terms, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't have any problem with boundaries. And again, I think, I would say one of my sort of less popular views as a strategist and strategy director was just like, hey guys, we're not the product. Like, I think too many people in strategy think they're the product. And it's like, no, like people buy creative. Like, this is what they want. And our job is to make better creative, like to help that happen. Like, but we're not the product. The creative is the product. Like, don't be fooled. And I think that's a sort of like, again, that's not a problem specific. Well, that particular one is a problem specific to the advertising industry, but it's not. I think every industry suffers from confusion by many folks who think they're the product when they're not.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, of course.
But I just think, like, again, my experience. This is classic, sort of like, your mileage may vary, but like. Working in small progressive places, I just never had to deal with that. And it was totally cool that I didn't have a creative title and I got to be involved. And I know that's been a lot of your life too. And it's just like, when you're in the right place where you're not working with creatives who are assholes and who like don't want to hear from people who don't have a creative title, then, it's just like, good. I don't think like we should stick a bunch of people in a room and have brainstorms with everybody. Like, I think there are better ways to come up with ideas, but I just think like, I contributed to many creative exercises where, some of which I became the lead on, even though I was running strategy. And it's just, like, I think that creativity requires that kind of fluidity. And I think that like, anywhere where those boundaries are so tightly, it's I just think it's a fundamental cultural problem that like, I don't know. I don't think it makes sense. And the best creatives I know are not like that, right? Like all the best creatives I know are very happy to collaborate with other people, whether they have a creative title or not, if they're creative.
Because those people, because they are effectively artists, right? And it's like going back to what you said earlier about, artists being fundamentally and intrinsically engaged with the unknown. It's, you have to be open to the possibility that inspiration will come or solution will come from a source that is not the most likely. It is fascinating. I was telling a story this morning at breakfast about one of the moments that was really, in hindsight, felt like a bad point of inflection or a point of bad inflection when I was at Vice. Was I was working with a young woman who was a creative on our branded content team and, in the commercial team. And we were just shooting the shit or something. And she was like, when I'm not here, I have this astrology Instagram handle that, I do fun stuff with, and it's cool. And I said, oh really? I mean, does anybody care about it? She's like, oh, I've got like 75,000 followers. And it's like, wait, and you've never brought this up before? And she's like, yeah, no, I didn't think anybody would care. And it's like, we're asking the wrong, we're not even asking the wrong questions. We're just sending the wrong signals about what value we're open to or what experience we're open to. Right. It's like, that was one for me. Lily, if you're listening, give a shout, say hello. Well, in any case, it's funny. What else? So we're getting towards the end of the hour here, Noah, but was there anything else that jumped out at you as being particularly indicative or
No, I mean, the other big one was back to the AI conversation, the article
Go
from
for
the
it.
Drum about the AI elephant in the room, that you'd never hire someone so mid. And I agree with a lot of the point there. It's from a VP of technology somewhere, I can't remember, Blast Radius maybe.
Sure.
And I think the point that's being made is totally reasonable. And I think kind of broadly it comes back to the point I was making, which is, the mistake I see. I was with an agency recently, giving a talk to their leadership team about AI. And, one of the funny parts of the conversation was, they asked about sort of how to use this in the creative process. And I was like, guys, why would you start there?
Right.
I saw a bunch of trophies when I walked in. Seems like you're really good at that. I might start somewhere else. I don't know. I was just like that is, that's not the first place I'd look. Would be to say, hey, there's this thing we're amazing at, that we have some of the best people in the world. Let's figure out how to help them do their job better, rather than
optimize lunch so that they can stay at the whiteboard. It's totally.
And I think, but I'd say the flip side of that is, I think we're now, we're sort of, there's so much hype around AI that we're in this whatever, many backlash cycles. So it's backlash to the backlash to the backlash to the backlash.
For sure.
Sometimes I read these things that I think, particularly what I was reacting to there is, the flip side of that is, I think these things are totally capable of doing above average work. They will not do it out of the box. It takes work. It takes expertise, right? And but if you look at the research that has come out on how to get the most out of these models, and it's there's a paper from Microsoft from December where they showed that, with an advanced enough prompting technique, you could get better answers out of a generic model than out of a fine-tuned model, right? And it's that's a big deal. And it means that you can go above average basically by being, but to do that, you need to know what you're asking about. You need to be an expert in that space. You need to know how to talk to it. There's a lot of challenges, but I do think again, in the sort of backlash to the backlash thing, whenever I read anything that is super certain, I just sort of I get a little tingly, and I'm like, I don't know. I think, shy away from certainty when it comes to AI is sort of my big takeaway.
Well, one thing that is certain is that all of these topics and others will be part of the brand conference May 8th in New York. I read an email today saying there were 4 more tickets. So by the time this comes out, they probably will be gone. But, in the event that you are the lucky last one, you should definitely go. I will go. And I'm really looking forward to it because I had a great time last year. And it was just the community of people, I think, Noah, that you attract is awesome, because it is full of people who are curious and want to, are not approaching this from the standpoint of certainty, but rather are, trying to share in the discovery. So kudos, you've managed. I feel like you've surrounded yourself with people like that always, which was one of the things I appreciate about you.
Thanks, man. Well, I love your community building efforts as well. I feel like we've always existed in these, I feel like what you're doing with Breakfast Club is sort of very much in the sort of mode of what we were doing with LikeMind back in the day, and just bringing interesting people together with no specific agenda. Magic things happen. It's awesome.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Well, that is the philosophy for sure. Well, listen, Noah, a pleasure. And reminder, guys, the Twitty Recommends site is at recommends.us.
Interesting.us.
Interesting. Sorry, excuse me again. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Colin. Hey, stop it. And of course, brand is with an X.ai. So look up both Noah's excellent newsletter on AI topics, and then also the brand conference itself next week. Anyway, Noah, we will see each other again soon. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, Ben.
You bet. Bye.